Juliet. Juliet, hello. Great to see you again.
Hello, Christy Lee. How are you going?
I am going great, thank you. It's a busy time at the time we're recording, I think, for everyone. But I'm excited to be here talking about today's topic. What about you? How are you going?
Yeah, not bad. Busy, as you say. But I love this topic, so I'm glad we're covering it. And I actually talked about this. I did a deep dive on this in my membership last month, November. So last month, yes. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's such a great topic, and my invested interest in human psychology plays right into what we're talking about today. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about the different generations in our workplaces and understand a little bit more about them, but also talk about leadership styles of those generations and also what they're looking for in our leaders. I find this absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so do I. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I always preface this with saying I think this is great stuff to be aware of, but that we need to be careful not to pigeonhole people as a generation, because, you hear that sort of like, oh, Gen X are so blah. And in fact, my teenage daughter uses boomer as a bit when she wants to sort of insult me in a gentle way. You're such a boomer. And I'm not a boomer, as I point out to her. But I just find it really interesting that young people think that's an insult. So I think
my stepson uses that as an insult as well. So it's certainly something that their age group, their similar ages, do, and they feel like they think it's hilarious as an insult. But we're not boomers.
Well, I love the fact that for them, probably anyone over 25 is probably considered so old that they're a boomer.
That's true.
Unimaginably old. Yes. So yes, I think there's so much we can learn from the different generations, and I think it's really good to understand the bigger influences on each generation. But I think it needs to be taken in the context of what is also going on for people as individuals, and what their life stage is as well.
Absolutely.
And so much to talk about.
So much. And I think it's important too to recognise that actually having a multi-generational workforce is really, really important. And I'm sure you've seen this as well. I know businesses that tend to hire a type, and inevitably that type has a look and an age. And so they're hiring all the same people, which is great when they want to just have friends. They're hiring their friendship circle, but it's not great when they've got different clients with different needs and they need different perspectives, because they all share the same views, because they are all from the same generation. And there's real value in having a multi-generational workforce.
I think that's true. And I think there's also just different energy that comes with each generation. So I was talking with someone the other day and we were remarking about how the young people coming up behind us have so much more energy, and they have a fresh perspective on things, and and they have a whole lot of value that they're bringing to things. And it's different to what we bring. I feel like my energy as I've got older, apart from flagging, is much steadier, and you come with experience and perspectives that younger generations don't have yet. But they certainly bring the energy and that powerhouse. So I think getting those different energies is also really fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where sometimes we tend to make gross generalizations about generations, and we say, look, they're a little older, they're a baby boomer, that they don't have the energy or even the capacity. I've certainly had businesses say they won't be able to pick that up fast enough. And I don't think that's true. And I've certainly seen younger people of younger generations struggle to pick new things up, where I've certainly seen some much older workplace participants have no stress around tech pickup and that kind of thing. So this is where we need to watch ourselves on our generalizations, I think.
So.
Yeah.
They're so easy to make, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So should we start looking at our baby boomers as a starting point, because they're probably the oldest generation currently in our workplaces?
Well, we should just probably give a quiet mention quickly to the silent generation, because there's still a few, particularly in family-owned businesses I see, who are, they're now in their mid-70s and older. So there's very few of them around, really. But when they are around, they tend to be in really senior positions and often have a lot of power. And I think these are our traditionalists. These are people who are born from the late 20s through to 1945. So they grew up in the shadow of wars. They're very respectful of hierarchy, and they expect that sort of respect.
That's true. Yeah. And these people are quite often in our businesses, maybe the founders of the business.
Yes.
They've been, as you said, part of a family-based business. And they do demand, not just in a very quiet way, a large amount of respect for the business that they have helped build.
Yes. And they tend to be very self-sufficient, really. And they expect that because they grew up in an environment where loyalty was a really big thing, they tend to have that expectation of loyalty, which can be challenging for them when younger generations coming through are not as attached to loyalty in the same way. It's interesting. They're often considered quite risk averse, which may be an age-related thing. But I see sometimes that's not always the case, you know, and this is where, again, we can't generalize about things, because I've worked with people from this generation who are really, really excited about opportunities. They're looking to innovate, and they're really happy to take risks, as long as they're the right risks, you know, as long as they've been thought through.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that generation, they had to be risk takers because of the environment that they grew up in. And I think this is where, whilst we don't make generalizations, this is where there are commonalities with our generations, because every generation grew up in the same global environment of the world events that were happening at that time. And this is post-war, and this is sort of new ideas and a fresh sense of energy in the world generally. And this generation was responsible for re-injecting some vibrance back into our economy at those times. And they did have to take risks in order to create businesses during that period. And so I think there is that element of the ones that took the risks are the ones reaping the rewards now.
I think that's true. And certainly what we see is, as a generation, that there's a focus for them on financial results. So, you know, that there's this respect for hierarchy. There's not so much a need to connect with people often. You know, that's a learned skill being brought in by different generations, as you say, bringing in different experiences.
This generation's independence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So so that's the silent generation. Let's move on to baby boomers, because, as you say, they are the biggest force, I think. And they are often the controlling force in business.
Yeah, very much so. So our baby boomers were born sort of 1946 through to the mid-60s, about 1964. So that's the group that we're talking about. And one of the things I think really sort of tells us a lot about baby boomers is their real belief, their work ethic, I guess, is that hard work reaps the rewards. They were about putting in all the hard work that you possibly can. And I think that has framed up how they show up in the workplace as well.
I think that's true. And I think, you know, because there was this boom, there was a shortage of, you know, places at school and jobs. And, you know, so there's quite a competitive streak to this generation. They really had to fight for what they wanted to get. So I think that comes through definitely in that competitiveness. Absolutely. And that resourcefulness. You know, this is a generation of problem solvers.
Yes.
You know, who are really, and, you know, for all the tag of being a boomer, this generation is the one that really has driven so much change.
Yes, because they really had an optimistic mindset. I guess the environment that they grew up in was more positive in terms of there was opportunity, there was possibility. So there was a very different feel to the generation prior in the environment they grew up in. But very much, I guess, one career path, I guess, is where baby boomers established themselves. They just worked at it and worked at it and worked at it to get better, to climb the ladder. You know, changing jobs regularly was not a hallmark of this generation, and still is not a hallmark of this generation. They're much more staid and steady in the workplace.
Yes, yeah, I think that's interesting too. And I think, I mean, this generation, they talk about how they grew up together. So this was still quite traditional family structures often, and often big families, you know, hence the boom. You know, there were a lot of people around. So this is a generation that also has those sort of family structures and values those relationships with big groups of people, you know?
Yeah, big. That's exactly what I think of. My parents both
Yes.
would be in this generation, both one of 5 children. And
Yes.
that's common of that time where most of us couldn't bear the thought of having 5 children.
Yes.
But that's that, and so the family gatherings are big. And so yes, in a workplace, surrounding themselves with people would be important.
And labour laws were changing as these people were growing up too. So there was more time for leisure, leisure was being encouraged. So, yeah, they got together and they did more social things than perhaps the silent generation before them. That was a bit more austere.
Yeah, a bit more structure, that there was work and then there was family or recreation time, definitely.
Yeah.
What about the leadership style of our baby boomers? What do they tend to be like as leaders in your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think what I see is they like to be acknowledged for their expertise, for their experience. And some of that is age related. I think, again, they tend to be in more senior roles now because just, they've been around for a while. They've been doing it for a while. What I see is that this is not a generation who grew up talking about stuff in terms of work. So in terms of being vulnerable around their leadership, in terms of seeking feedback or giving feedback, that's not really something that they're that familiar with. And I think they didn't grow up with it in a family sense. They might have been disciplined, but they didn't have those easy feedback models. And certainly the vulnerability thing I see is really difficult for this generation.
Yeah, the leadership style, I think, tends to be just much more directive. It's
yes,
just, this is very matter of fact. This is what we need to get done. Let's just get it done. We don't need to flop around with everything else.
Yes.
So they don't have that, like you said, those softer skills of having those communication models around them.
And I see them mentoring and supporting younger people a lot. And I think that's part of that, wanting to be acknowledged for the skills that they bring, which is, that, you talked about it being very competitive for them. I think that acknowledgement of those skills and experience is part of the mentoring and supporting younger people.
Yeah, and I think they even do that. They almost skip a generation in terms of that, I've noticed. Yeah. So they tend to really gravitate towards your Gen Ys and your Gen Zs more in that mentoring, which I don't really know why. I've just noticed that as a pattern, but I find that really interesting. But on that point, if you have baby boomers in your business and they are seeking or showing signs of wanting to be a mentor or a guide, I would absolutely bake that into your business, because there's so much gold in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is when we talk about the benefits of multi-generational workforces, this is how you start to really tap into that, is using some of this. I think also this is a generation that is sandwiched between supporting their parents and the younger generations too. Because we're living longer, the baby boomers are this first generation who are really, I think, caught between some of that.
Yeah, I was talking to, where was I? Yesterday, being interviewed on another podcast, and I was talking about the pressures, and we were talking about the pressures particularly on women in business, but about this challenge that I'm seeing show up more and more about having to care for elderly parents and elderly relatives. And that's quite a burden. And I think you're right, this is the first generation that's really impacted in such a significant way, that are still navigating the workforce at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think so. And often have quite senior roles in the workforce. That's what I see. So they're grappling with a whole lot of different things.
Yeah, definitely. So following our baby boomers, we have Gen X, which is, I'm a Gen X. You're a Gen X, aren't you? I think.
I scraped into Gen X. So I'm hanging on to that so that I'm not a boomer.
You own it, sister. So Gen X is 65 through to 79. And look, I think it's fair to say that when Gen X showed up in the workplace, baby boomers were not our biggest fans, because we, as Gen X, had a very, very different approach to work. And probably shook things up a little bit for a much more traditional workplace generation, just like the generations since us have done the same to us as well. So this is where it's great to get that difference. So Gen X, what's your take on Gen X?
Well, I mean, I think for me, what I see is that this is a generation that grew up when the world was changing significantly. So this is the generation who grew up with mothers starting to go to work. So often they had much less adult supervision. There wasn't a mother at home when they got home from school all the time. So there's a bit more reliance on friends and a bit more self-reliance, I think.
Super independent as a generation.
Yes.
And I think that family structure was changing through this generation too, in dual income households. Absolutely.
Divorce was coming in.
Exactly. Smaller family units as well. So I think the previous generations, when there were so many, often children in a family, the older children helping look after the younger children, there wasn't so much of that. Or we were starting to see that taper off, I think.
I think so, but also we're starting to see more information coming at them. So TV is a big deal for this generation. And I think things were changing. So there weren't as many, sort of wholesome family shows. There was a bit more provocative content on there, and they were being challenged with things. And so they talk about this generation being a bit skeptical. They grew up with things, with being taught to question things, I think. Yeah. And that the idyllic sort of lifestyle wasn't necessarily the reality for many of them.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know as a child, I asked, but why? 70,000 billion times a day. And that, I think that's our generation. We grew up questioning everything.
Exactly.
We learned that, I think, to an extent. I think there's this sense of questioning, a little bit of cynicism around Gen X. And I think what really changed in the workplace is because we were willing to question everything, we also questioned, why is working harder and longer hours the only way forward, which was the hallmark of the generations before us. And we really questioned that. And I think that's where we really ruffled some feathers, because the older generations just didn't question those things. They were loyal. They accepted the status quo. We were less keen on the status quo.
I think that's right, yes. And the casualisation, I mean, this is the generation that brought in Casual Friday. Yeah. God bless them. A wardrobe challenge once a week we all need.
Exactly. Casual Friday could be your most stressful day of the week.
Absolutely. Gosh, yes. But yes, as you say, this is not a generation that was as interested in the hierarchy and the formality. So that they brought in this more casual and perhaps more direct way of addressing things, because they grew up as critical thinkers, as sort of a bit more skeptical. They're questioning things much more. And what I see is that they're also, because they're not that interested in hierarchy, this is the generation that's building flatter organisational structures. Yeah. So they'd rather have a slightly bigger team than have layers in that team.
And I think we saw the rise of smaller businesses through this generation.
That entrepreneurial thing. Yes.
Yeah. I think the other key thing that really changed was, like you referenced with TV and technology, computers started turning up as this generation was hitting the workforce. We were talking to our teenagers the other day and explaining what it was like to be at uni and in our first jobs, where there was one computer with a DOS program, and the first printer that we got was, I can't remember what it's called, but had those little holes in the side and it would churn through, and the dial-up internet. That's it. And dial-up internet. That it's so far removed from what the younger generations have grown up in, but it was such a revolution at that time compared to what the generations before us had been doing at work. So there was so much tech change coming into play. I mean, nothing like what we see now, but for that time it was.
Well, this is a very tech savvy generation, in fact. The founders of things like Google and eBay and Netscape, lots of those sorts of things were founded by Gen Xers. Yeah. And I agree. My first, I worked in a share registry when I was still at uni, and that was all paper-based. Yeah. So you had to compare certificates with things. And I moved in that company. I was working for an accounting firm then, and we had a computer room. And if you wanted to do something on the computer, you went in and you worked at the one terminal in this enormous room that was filled with a computer.
Yeah.
Nobody had a computer on their desk, you know, it was none of that sort of thing.
No.
So, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But, yeah, I think this is a very tech-savvy generation. And I think that is also, I mean, apart from that sort of feeding that entrepreneurialism, I think this is also where this idea of work-life balance came from too, because these are the guys who question, as you say, that sort of, do we really need to do this way?
Mm-hmm.
You know, isn't there a better way to do this? And I think
it's all
technology
about
helped
smarter,
that.
not harder. Definitely.
Yes, and they hooked into technology to do that, I think.
Yeah. And what about as leaders? What do you see in the Gen Xers you work with in terms of their leadership style? I think they're far less directive
yes,
than the baby boomers, which has its pros and cons. But what do you see?
It's interesting. A lot of them, what I see is they like to work quite autonomously.
Mm-hmm.
Then they like responsibility. They like getting stuff done, definitely. Yeah. But there's certainly there's still a generation that has been looking for advancement. But yeah, as you say, I see them also looking for that balance.
Yes.
Looking for work-life balance. Yeah, not necessarily loving teams, though, is what I see.
Actually, that is very true with the Gen X entrepreneurs and leaders that I work with.
Yeah.
They find it really, which is so interesting, I find. But I think they like to coordinate workflow, but don't necessarily like to coordinate people.
Yes, yes. I think that's exactly right. Yes. And happy to take responsibility for the workflow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they seem to really, to me, they like to be led by someone that gets stuff done. So they like to be led by someone that's, right, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, and take action. That's my experience there, that's what they seem to enjoy in their leaders. So,
and they don't want to be micromanaged.
Oh no.
You know, they want the autonomy to do what they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, not many people like being micromanaged anyway, but this is certainly, as a generational thing, you know, I do see that sort of autonomy and responsibility coming through.
Yeah.
But happy to be told what needs to happen.
Yeah.
But we'll want to work
it out. But then
want
to go and get it done. Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And I think they're making up a huge chunk of our leaders in businesses currently. So it's interesting to watch that sort of transition play out as well.
And interestingly, again, to me, this is a generation that still struggles with that vulnerability as a leader, struggles with the whole giving and receiving feedback, although I think they are finding it definitely easier to get on board with some of that than boomers.
Definitely. And I think what I sort of, now that we talk about this, what I notice with the Gen X leaders who don't like leading, they're not as direct as the baby boomers, and that can actually cost them, because they assume that everyone can kind of read their mind, or everyone's on the same page, or obviously that's how I want it done. And therefore they don't communicate as directly sometimes as they should and need to, and that's often that is the tipping point that then causes the frustration that they have with people.
Yes, yeah. That's a really interesting point, and I think that's really true.
It's interesting. We might need to do a whole episode on Gen X leaders.
Yes. Well, it might be useful because, you know, I think they have a lot of influence at the moment.
Yes.
You know, I think these are the people who, as you say, a lot of them are in positions of leadership. So
and a lot of them are running their own businesses. That
those entrepreneurs. Definitely. Yeah.
So interesting. So let's move on to Gen Y. Now, I am not ashamed to admit that I may or may not have got myself in a little bit of trouble about commentary about Gen Y at one point in the past.
Oh, okay.
But I think it was misconstrued, because I don't think there is a perception that, and does not come from me, comes from many people though, that Gen Y are a little lazy. And I don't think that's true. I just think they're different, and people really struggled with that. So Gen Y, so we're clear, born 1980 through to the mid-90s. They're also called the millennials, Gen Y, so same. And it's a much more social group, aren't they?
They're very connected, yes. And this is a group who really grew up with a slight difference at school. You know, they did a lot of team-based projects at school because the way we taught started to shift.
That's a really interesting point, actually. The education system underlying all of these generations has shifted throughout this, and that has formed the individuals coming into our workplaces.
Definitely. And what I see with these millennials is they are much more open to collaborating. They just expect to collaborate, and they're quite good at communicating because of that. But this is the first generation where I would say that because of this, they want feedback. So they want to know how they're going. And they're pretty comfortable about giving and receiving feedback.
They're very comfortable with giving and receiving feedback.
Yeah.
And Gen X and baby boomers found that really challenging.
Totally.
Because it's so far out of their comfort zone. Yeah. And I want to say particularly for baby boomers, but I think it's also true of Gen X. I think there was a perception of, who do you think you are giving us that feedback? We didn't solicit that feedback.
Yes. Well, if we want your feedback, we'll, tell you, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So this has really changed how we communicate in the workplace.
I think this is also the generation where their parents were very involved in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
this is parents.
Yes, this is where the term started, wasn't it? So this is a group of children who are growing up being told they're special.
Yeah.
Getting lots of praise. They're probably being sheltered by that helicoptering, so that bad things don't happen to them. But their parents are very in their lives. And this is where you're starting to see friendships, between parents and their children, which is, whilst not a new concept at all, it seems to be it's a shift, I think, with this generation. The friendships are different. There's more sharing at a younger age, and there's more connection between parents and their children, I think.
Yeah, and a very different type or style of parenting started to emerge, not just around their involvement, but in generations before, it was expected that you would get into the workforce at a pretty young age and, juggle, either leave school to work or juggle school and work. Yeah. This generation, what I started to see, and it sort of morphed into Gen Z as well, was parents were suggesting that, no, you don't need to go out and work. We're going to take care of it, because they didn't want their children to struggle the same way that they struggled. So it was out of care that they sort of said, just focus on your studies. You don't need to work. But what happened then was we had a whole cohort of people hitting the workforce that didn't have those foundation skills around workplace etiquette, what was appropriate, what to do if you're sick.
Yep. But at the same time, they were very self-confident.
Yes.
And very used to sort of talking about how everybody's doing. So, and they've grown up with this kind of, every voice matters approach. Yep. So, yes, it's an interesting generation, this one, I think, coming in. And because they're very collaborative, they're often brilliant in a team.
Yes.
Once they settle in and once everybody gets used to this idea that there's going to be more talking about how we're going.
Yes.
I also see them being much more values-driven. When I was working with a consulting firm and I was working with their graduate recruitment program, and honestly watching the young grads come through at that time. And I remember one day, one of the graduates, we had a panel with partners in the firm and a whole lot of graduates who had been through an interview process. There were a number of interview phases. And at this was just a sort of a Q&A session. And one of them asked the partner group what they were doing about their their CSR. Now, she didn't say corporate social responsibility. She just said, what's the firm do about their CSR? And you could see the partners just look at one another, no idea what the acronym even meant. So she said, your corporate social responsibility. And again, they're still looking at one another. And one of the partners said, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. And you could see this group from this generation just going, well, who are you if you don't think in this very values-driven way? And I see this generation choosing where they work and who they work with often.
Absolutely.
In terms of their values.
Absolutely. And this is important really to acknowledge when our workplaces are in a flux, a bit of a time of change, that your ability to communicate your values, mean what your work means in the bigger world, even if it's making widgets, it has an impact, is going to help you attract and retain this generation. Because if they feel like they're going to work just to do a job with zero connection to something bigger, they're simply not going to take the job. So it is, and I think it's really, helped other generations to reframe and refocus on what is actually important in the world. So I think it's been a really good contribution.
Yeah. And this is a generation that wants to have a say. They really want to be able to talk about these things and have a view on them.
Yeah. And I think because of how they've grown up and the, super supportive parenting style that they had, they're looking for that in their leaders as well. So they want to feel supported. So the ability of the leader to show empathy, support, vulnerability, and not necessarily that means, put up with poor performance, but to be a supportive leader, that's what this generation's looking for.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. And structure, they want to be guided by leaders, but they also want to be heard by those leaders. So they don't expect it to just be a one-way relationship. I think they're also, and I think there's also a sense of the what's in it for me that comes through in terms of how they seek career development. So, with older generations, it's for the good of the firm sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't see that with this generation. I see them saying, well, what does this mean for my career?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's might have come out of McCrindle, this quote, but they the way they approach their careers is they work with organisations, not for an organisation.
Yes. Yeah, and that's such a shift, isn't it, in thinking?
Huge shift for that generation. And this is the first generation really that is going to have several careers at the same time. And it will not be unusual that this generation will have a job and a side hustle and maybe a second job. The old traditional one job at a time, progression through that career, that's out the window for this generation.
I think so, yes. Yeah. And just that valuing of things that aren't, they certainly, they want, they value their life outside of work.
Yes.
And they do certainly value results and financial rewards. But I think this is also a generation that's looking for that non-financial rewards as well in terms of that.
This is the generation that will actually use their community service leave and want the ability to take time off to invest time in something that is important to them, whether it's charity or whether it's some other cause or pursuit. They will want that opportunity.
And will want their work to engage with the things they're interested in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So really interesting generation. I think Gen Y possibly made the biggest change, but a very significant change in how we work.
Yes, I think so too. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And then we have our Gen Zs. And look, we are parents of Gen Z, so we've got probably plenty to say about this, but mid-90s through to 2009, an interesting generation. And I think one of the biggest things that I see play out in this generation is there is not doing one thing at a time. They are doing several things at a time all the time. And I think what we all need, and I see this frustration play out with employers saying, why have they got their mobile phone on their desk? Because they can actually get both things done, and it's not a distraction to them because they have grown up with technology in their fingertips, multiple sources coming at them at any one time, and they're fine with it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Interestingly, because these are our digital natives, really, aren't they? These are the ones who have grown up with, who don't really understand old-fashioned phones. Think they're rather quaint.
They don't understand. Yeah.
We'll
have to take back to an antique store to show them the old ring around style of phone.
Yes, exactly. As my daughter said when she was very young, why would you invent a phone where you had to do that when you could just press the buttons?
Technology wasn't there yet, my love.
Yes, exactly. And I think you're right. I think this is the generation that is doing, has a side hustle, this is the gig economy, isn't it? You know, where they'll shift from things to things. What I see though is that whilst technology is just a given in their world, they are looking for the human side in work. They're looking for connection with people at work.
Yep.
And I think that's really interesting, that technology now is such a given in their lives that it's not exciting in the way it was for maybe, you know, the baby boomers or even Gen X. It's just a given. So now we've gone back to, I want to connect with people in my work.
Yeah. And we probably won't talk about the alpha gen today because they're not really hitting our workplaces yet, but that is definitely going to show up for them even more, this human connection.
I think so.
But Gen Z has definitely started. And I think interestingly, but the difference between Gen Y and Gen Z is Gen Y were, you know, fun, social, confident, a little bit security was not so important to them. But with Gen Z, we are seeing a flip back to actually wanting some sense of security in some aspect.
Yes.
Because I think they have, you know, if you think about the challenging times, they have probably seen, some of them would have seen parents struggle with, we had recessions and so forth. There were challenging periods. So there is a sense of, yes, I want all of that independence and individuality in my work, and I want to do multiple things at once, but I've got to pin to security somewhere in some capacity. So that's a bit of a change that we didn't see that in the Gen Y.
I think that's right. And you know, again, this is a generation that wants feedback. And what we know about this generation is they want really regular feedback. So we're talking about they'd like to check in with their manager at least a few times a week.
Yep.
You know, so they don't just want it once a month or, you know.
And they're not after a big, long, formal conversation. They just want, am I on task? Am I on track? Are we heading in the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is really interesting too. I think also, you know, if you have these people in your team, what we know is that they learn in snatches. You know, when you talk about them having their phone by them, I think if you're trying to teach them things, you know, they talk about micro learning, giving them little bites of stuff to get their heads around, and self-directed learning. I think this is a generation that's used to doing a lot of self-directed work.
Yeah, and again, if we go back, I guess, to the education system, this is the generation where schools started to really tailor learning to individuals, and teachers have had a tough, you know, time of it in terms of the expectation on teachers has been that you're going to pick up all the different learning styles and whether they learn best, you know, in this way or that way or the other way, and deliver all your content in all of the ways. So they are used to having, you know, an experience of a learning style that works for them. And they're also getting pretty good at self-identifying that actually I don't learn best that way. And that's okay, which we would never have acknowledged that as our generation, but they will quite readily say, I learn best, you know, with audio visual kind of work. I learn best by doing the task, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's right, because they're being taught these things, you know, at school. And I think, you know, when we talk about feedback, these generations, these newer generations coming through are being taught to have these conversations with one another in ways that we were never taught. So, yeah, I think that's true too. And, you know, they bring an energy. They
do bring an energy. And then the leadership style that I'm seeing is they like to empower the people that they're looking to lead. So they bring that kind of energy. And they like to work collaboratively as well.
I was just going to say that the collaborative thing is definitely there. And again, I think this is coming through from the education system.
Yeah.
You know, they're doing more and more collaboration at school. They're being taught about leadership at school. They're getting opportunities to lead at school often.
Absolutely.
That's coming through.
Definitely, because I think of my youngest, who is just an alpha, but only just. She's in year 5 now, and they're doing leadership. Well, they should be doing leadership camps. They're not. They're doing a leadership day. But for that year 5 cohort, it has been common for, as far as my kids have been in primary school, to do leadership camps at that age. So they're really starting to build leadership as a skill into schooling, which I think is, look, I think it's fabulous. I remember going to uni and having to do my first ever group assignment, and I thought it was the worst experience in the world.
Totally. Oh my God. Yes. Nightmare.
But that'd be the independence of Gen X coming out in that respect.
I think that's it. And because that was our first experience of it, you know, as older teenagers, really.
Yeah, it was certainly not baked into school.
No, exactly. So I think that's very different. And I think that's a huge benefit for teams when you have people coming through who are just used to collaborating in that way. I think it's fabulous. Yeah. And I think, even we talk about working across generations, this generation, in a way, is often not as good at explaining technology to older generations as perhaps their slightly older cohorts are, because it's such a natural thing for them. It's like, well, how can you not understand? Exactly. Whereas Gen Z, Gen Y are often better at explaining it because it was a bit new for them too.
Yeah.
So they grew up with things changing and developing.
That's true. Yeah. No, Gen Z definitely just, it's part of their DNA.
What do you mean? Yeah. So, so I think there's all sorts of ways we can harness some of these difference across generations. And I think, and then you layer all of that over life stage.
Yes.
So, people at different stages of their lives will have different needs in a team and different, we'll be looking for different support. We'll be looking to engage differently, and we know that from young, feckless, no responsibility coming into a workforce to, settling, having a family potentially, having older children, having older parents, all of those life stage issues need to be layered over these generational things too.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think fundamentally today's episode has been about just understanding a little bit, not in great detail, just a little bit about each generation. So you understand where they're coming from, their perspectives, and understand how they might show up at work and why that is a great thing.
I think so. And as we say, being aware of the generational differences is really powerful, but avoid bias, trying to avoid that sort of, oh, they're that.
Yes.
Oh, you're such a boomer.
Yeah. You don't go saying that to our baby boomers.
That's it.
No. And recognise the importance of having that multi-generational workforce. And if you can milk the best out of each generation, that's going to be great for your team.
I think so. And talk to them, talk to the team about this stuff. Acknowledge some of the stuff.
Feels like I'm on broken record saying that to people at the moment, but I'm like, have you spoken to them? Have you actually had a conversation? Seems simple, but something we can
chat to your team.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Lovely. Well, thank you, Christy Lee. Lovely to talk. I think, as you say, perhaps there's a whole episode just talking about Gen X too.
Yeah, we could probably do a series where we do one episode on each generation and go a little deeper.
We might do that, because I think there's a lot to say. And there's perhaps people we can bring in to talk about some of those things too.
Oh, great idea. I love that idea.
Lovely. See you soon.
Okay, thanks, Juliette.
Bye.